I'm joined by Paul Bremer, who was the presidential envoy to Iraq under former President George W. Bush and also served as U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands. Phil Mattingly joining me as well, the Bloomberg White House correspondent who has been on top of this unfolding story. And Phil, let me start with you on these troops, a handful of troops that the president is going to send.
That's right, Betty. What the president did last night is inform Congress that he has sent 275 troops to Iraq. Now, these troops, Betty, are being sent almost entirely for protection reasons with the U.S. Embassy inside Baghdad. However, the president also met last night with his top national security team officials to start weighing options. Here's what we know is certainly on the table. Obviously, airstrikes is something the administration has opened the door to. We know drone operations are also something they're looking at. Another issue emerged last night, and that's the possibility of a limited number of special operators also entering the country. Now, Betty, a key point here that we've been told, U.S. officials saying those operators wouldn't be used for combat reasons, but they are essential if any type of airstrike or drone operation is to occur. U.S. forces will need to be on the ground purely for targeting and intel purposes, Betty. So lots of action, but no concrete moves yet.
And Ambassador Paul, you say that we need boots on the ground.
Yes, basically along the lines that were just described. You know, the ISIS, although it's been moving very fast the last week, really has some weaknesses. There are not very many of them. They number in the thousands. They're lightly armed, and they are unpopular, in effect. You can't go around executing prisoners of war and be popular very long. So we have, I think, two military objectives. We need to stop the southward movement of the ISIS, and that will require airstrikes on their lines of communication, and eventually, secondly, help the Iraqis retake the cities, which will require drone attacks. You can't do either of those effectively without good intelligence, and so we will have to have intelligence collectors, special forces of some kind, forward fire control people on the ground, and I think we should therefore insist when we do that we get a status of forces agreement for those servicemen, as we have all over the world.
What kind of an operation, what size of an operation are we talking about?
I would leave to the military planners. I think the important thing here is now to get moving. Time is a wasting. President made his speech about the interests that we have there on Friday. It's now Tuesday morning. We need to get going.
Phil, there's no appetite, is there? I mean, we pulled out a few years ago. There's no appetite among Americans to go back into Iraq.
Well, certainly if you look at public polling, no, there's no appetite really for Americans to have troops pretty much anywhere right now, if you look at it. Look, I think this is an issue the Obama administration is having a very difficult time with. Betty, they've cited pulling out of Iraq as one of their primary foreign policy achievements for the better part of the last 2.5 years. This is an administration that ran their first presidential campaign on getting out of Iraq. The fact that they're faced with an incredibly complex and, as the ambassador said, very fast-moving issue right now is really thrown them a bit for a loop. I think they've got a lot of options on the table, but how quickly they move on those, I think in part they're staring at the situation saying, I can't believe we are dealing with Iraq this many years later.
Ambassador, you say that ISIS is vulnerable, that they're not that well organized, but are they well funded?
Well, I didn't say they were not well organized. They are well organized. There just aren't that many of them, and they have vulnerabilities, particularly in their lines of communication leading back to Syria. They seem to have pinched quite a lot of money from the banks in Mosul, so they seem to be well funded. Look, the president correctly identified our major interest here on Friday when he said that it is not in our interest that this terrorist group should gain a foothold in the heart of the Middle East. This is not Afghanistan behind the mountains somewhere. This is right in the heart of historic Arab Middle East with a lot of money. And the idea of the ISIS getting control of Iraq should be a major problem for America. And I think that's the interest we got to focus on right now.
But explain to me a little bit more about how they're funded, Ambassador.
Well, they've been funded because they've been able to take over a lot of the eastern part of Syria in the war against Assad. They are also getting funds from some elements of the Gulf states, as Al-Qaeda always did. This is basically an al-Qaeda type organization, although they're even so extreme that al-Qaeda has declared they're not part of us. They basically are an al-Qaeda operation, and they're funded more or less as al-Qaeda's been funded.
Phil, is there any possibility on the financial side to weaken this group?
Betty, I think the difficulty that, look, the U.S. Treasury has been very effective on the sanctions regime, anti-terror sanctions regime, really going back to the Bush administration. The issue they're facing right now is this group is largely kind of raiding banks. This seems very simplistic, but they're pulling millions of dollars out of banks with each town they move through. So it's not an international finance regime that they can disrupt. So that kind of limits, if not eliminates entirely, what the U.S. can do on that front.
All right, Phil, thank you so much. Phil Mattingly, our White House correspondent, also to Ambassador Paul Bremer, the former presidential envoy to Iraq.